G'day, folks. Sorry I can't be there in person, I guess, but that's the way of the world at the moment. But what I want to talk to you about is basically some of the research we've been doing from Australia with myself, but also colleagues from Monash and the Critical Minerals Consortium, and also Simon Zhao at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. And basically looking at what that means in terms of sustainable supply options to meet all of the technological demands that we have this coming few decades, I guess, and perhaps beyond. But also acknowledging the support we've had from Geoscience Australia for a lot of this research. Now, one of the problems I think that's out there's a lot of people that think that this lack of data on a lot of our critical elements really mean that we have a lack of data on the actual supply potential. And part of that is the fact that there's really the only group that publishes global estimates of reserves. And of course, remembering that we really should be very mindful that reserves has a technical meaning in mining. It's the short-term economic and profitable resources that we can mine, or profitable mineralization that we can mine. I really should be careful about my own words, I guess. And so the only group that really tries to do global estimates of reserves, and of course trying to get equivalence around these things internationally, is very difficult, but the USGS do the best they can. All right, and so if we look at the various elements they've got out there, there's often a lack of data. That lack of data can be driven by the fact that we're dealing with substitute elements. So elements such as cadmium, germanium, and indium really only substitute into the primary economic minerals. So if we take indium, for example, it's a substitute element in minerals like sphalerite. And so wherever we're mining zinc, zinc sulfide, sphalerite, we'll always get some indium. The question is how much. But because of that, we focus on the zinc. The indium, if you're lucky, might be 1% of the value of the zinc. So we tend to ignore that zinc content. And the same thing we see with bismuth and cadmium and many others. And things like cadmium are seen as a toxic element. So they're seen as a penalty in the way that we process. So they're not seen as something we want. But with cadmium telluride solar panels, we need more cadmium. And so we need to understand this thing. But if we compare that to our traditional metals such as gold and iron ore, we do have excellent data. So we have the methods, we have the ability to do this. It's just that we haven't been doing it, I guess, for a lot of these elements. All right, and again, really, as I mentioned before, a lot of these elements are very small markets. They're readily supplied by a handful of companies or sometimes countries around the world. All right, and they're typically very low value. And that's what we're really seeing. If we're looking at the global iron ore industry, it's probably 250 billion US dollars, of which Australia would be, say, half. Now, if you're looking at, say, silver or indium and a whole bunch of other metals, right, we're looking at stuff that's really, really small value. And so it's not something that creates a high driver. All right, and so typically if you're operating, say, a copper mine, you're worried about copper and maybe gold, maybe silver, but not much else. All right, and so what that means is that if there are any of these substitute elements that carry through in the concentrates that make it through to the smelters and the refineries, that leaves it up to the smelting and refining companies. All right, and so often that means this lack of data, this lack of understanding of how much is in resources, how much is in concentrates, how much is actually flowing through our smelters and refineries. That's often confused. There's lack of data means lack of supply. And that's absolutely not true. It's right. And so I guess what we've been doing is steadily working through a lot of these sorts of problems now. So we've had research published on cobalt, a classic sort of byproduct element that's associated with nickel as well as cobalt, as well as trying to understand, well, if you're looking at some of the most critical areas like rare earth elements, but also methods such as indium and others, all right, how can we start to build a better database, a better understanding, and really quantify, well, how much supply potential really is there? And so from Australia's point of view, I guess we've got a lot of the primary elements that could be hosts to the substitute critical elements, as well as the deposits of things like rare earths and lithium and many others as well. So we've been, I suppose, looking at that now for some time. Now, if we look at critical metals, we can see that this sort of little white area, we can see how small that is in comparison to all the others over time. And this is looking at the proportional economic value in equivalent $1998 over the last century or so. And so we can see, if we look at the data, we can look at the amount of tellurium that we've actually been extracting from our copper refineries. And so we can see that it goes up and then comes back down. And same with rhenium and then indium as well. So as I mentioned, a lot of these critical metals, they're dominated by particular countries, and so we're concerned about that supply. And so typically when we're looking at critical minerals, when we don't really find primary deposits of them, and so we have to rely on these primary elements. And so really that's one of the things that I guess, given that we have good data on the primary elements, we can then estimate what that means in terms of critical minerals as well. So a lot of the work we've been doing here is looking at various elements, whether it's the primary, sometimes elements that are reported directly like scandium, lithium, and rare earth. But where we don't have direct data, we have to come up with some way of estimating that. And so the method we've been using is what I often call the Werner method, where we use geochemical relationships, geochemical databases between the host mineral or element such as, say, zinc and, say, indium, to then look at the way we can estimate the grades for the critical metal. All right, and so again, it's fairly straightforward, but it does take a lot of work. If we look at Australia, we've seen over time the rise and fall of different sectors of our mining industry. So we started out with a relatively small black coal industry, but it was all that we mined. Then we discovered copper, then the gold industry boomed, the tin industry here, which is this miscellaneous metals here, that's mostly tin. We can see the rise of Broken Hill and the rise of lead, zinc, silver. And again, if we look at the magnitude of these numbers, really black coal and iron ore have really dominated our industry now. All right, and so, and again, it just shows you this changing time. So we still have plenty of these primary metals left. It's, I guess, really, really important to understand that. A recent study we've literally just submitted is looking at global nickel, and that's looking at all the different deposits of nickel around the world, our magmatic sulfides of numerous types, our flood basalts related, our intrusion related, komatiites, impact related such as Sudbury, as well as the primary different types of nickel laterite ore, our clay silicates, hydrous magnesium silicates and oxides, and a handful of miscellaneous other deposits as well. And so what we can see if we start to decode this graph is the triangles are all the nickel laterite. So they're here, they're typically higher grade and some quite large deposits too. Our magmatic sulfides are often lower grade. You can get some quite large deposits, including up here. But what that shows you is there's two different classes. Now, often our magmatic sulfides have a polymetallic nature to them. They're nickel, copper, cobalt, and platinum group element as well. And so when you start converting that and say, well, let's take the grade and convert that to the equivalent US dollar value per ton of ore, we see that the overall grades of co-products and byproducts such as copper, cobalt, and the PGEs basically link in with the nickel laterites where you may or may not have cobalt present. And we get a much more sort of uniform sort of spread here. And the reason that's important is because Skinner back in the 1970s argued that really we have two distributions, I guess, of metals typically. We have our higher grade mineral deposits, which may be sulfides or oxides or something like that. And then you've got bulk silicate rock, whether that be granite or limestone perhaps or something else. Right? But really we're mining this rich rock. And why that's important is because when you go through this mineralogical barrier, this switch from one distribution to the other, this mineralogical barrier where you change that mineral type, of course, that means you have this massive increase in energy intensity for the amount of energy required to extract that particular metal. All right, and so that creates this barrier to the economic extraction of that metal. And so that's really, really important. And so a lot of our data, I guess, really reinforces this. But if we look at some individual copper mines and so on, we could just have a select view here, and there's a lot more out there from our various papers. We could look at Mount Isa in Western Queensland here in Australia, and it's been continually increasing its amount of resources. All right, we can see here the amount of production in red over time versus the official reserves versus additional resources and the potential for an open cut expansion there. Antamina is another one where we see continual expansion over time, and same with Olympic Dam. And this is a very common pattern. It doesn't always happen with mines, of course. Eventually, at some point, a mine does become depleted. Right? It depends on the deposit, the geology, the economics, the technology involved, all of these sorts of things. Hidden behind all of that is this long-term trend of declining ore grade. And I still find it difficult to believe that there are people out there who believe it's not a real problem. We could look at copper, it's all downhill. We could look at nickel, it's all downhill. We could look at lead, it's all downhill. Zinc, all downhill. I have the same graphs for gold and other commodities as well. Right. Now, within that, we need to understand the host economic minerals, how refractory the ore is, what processing technology is possible, but also things like impurities, whether they're toxic or valuable, and so on, right? And that's quite important to understand our critical minerals, but what it means is that we're having to process more and more tons of ore to get our basic metals that we're looking for. Right? So that means that our environmental impact is going up. It does not mean we're running out. It means our environmental impact is going up. And so if we look at copper in closer detail, we can see Australia rich oxide ores here in the mid-1800s. By about the turn of the century, we're down to sulfide ores and tiny bit of moving up and down between underground and open cut. But again, our long-term trend is all downhill, right? And pretty much every country around the world follows that same sort of pattern. Let's look briefly at some case studies. So if we look at scandium, it's probably one of the very few elements we don't really mine on a great global scale yet. But that's just changed. In the Philippines now, we've just started mining and extracting scandium on a commercial scale. And so that's associated with nickel laterite production. All right, so the main demand for scandium could be aluminium scandium alloys, these super performing lightweight alloys, but also solid oxide fuel cells emerging. And maybe they'll emerge a lot more, I'm not sure. We'll see what happens with the hydrogen economy. All right, and so certainly in Australia, we have a whole range of nickel laterites that are known to have scandium. So again, this is based on reported data. So we can say, look, we've got quite a lot of scandium. So even if we're producing 50 tons a year at the moment, say most of which would come from the Philippines, we can see that Australia's resources and reserves alone represents a huge body of scandium that could help supply and meet these sort of global demands. Rare earths is something that people often talk about quite a lot. We can see the rise of China in this sort of graph here. But again, we need to understand whether we're talking about the light or the heavy rare earth fractions. Right? But again, because of this rapid technological change we've seen over recent years, we need rare earths more and more and more. And whether that's from military technology, but also renewable energy, electric vehicles, wind turbines, everything. So if we look at Australia, we can see our rare earths are mostly sitting in deposits. The vast majority of this blue area would actually just be one deposit at Olympic Dam. All right, and so that's something of the order of 50 million tons alone. All right, and so at the moment, we have two primary mines at Mount Weld in Western Australia, but also Browns Range on the West Australia Northern Territory border, as well as some other projects which are probably not too far away potentially, as well as heavy mineral sands as a potential byproduct in terms of monazite extracted along with rutile, ilmenite, and zircon. So we can plot that out and we can look at where around the world are our rare earths. We can see China, Bay and Obo, for example, Olympic Dam here, and a whole range of other deposits. But again, we need to understand the detail. If we look at lithium, for example, we can see that Australia over the last sort of 10 to 15 years especially has had a huge growth in the amount of lithium that we can see as economic and potentially sub-economic to mine in the near future. And so Australia now, and I think we've moved forward even from this position, we're now at about 70 kilotons of lithium at about 100 kilotons of lithium worldwide. All right, and so that our lithium now, our exports of lithium, is actually now more valuable than our uranium exports, which is a huge turning point, I think, in Australia and the way we're looking at our mining industry. And I mentioned this sort of substitute nature. And so when you're looking at an element like rhenium, it's the one that provides these sort of high temperature, super strong alloys that are used in things like jet turbines, as I showed earlier. And so it's a substitute element in molybdenite, so molybdenum sulfide. And so we can look at the geochemical data for something like rhenium versus molybdenum. And we know that this is for the Merlin deposit on the left. We can see that once you get up into more economic grades of rhenium, you can get a fairly good linear correlation typically between the rhenium concentration and the molybdenum concentration. And you could see for Borovic in Serbia, it's again another reasonable correlation between our rhenium and our molybdenum. So even though globally we don't have a lot of data on rhenium, we do have a lot of data on molybdenum, and so we can use these types of relationships in order to then say, well, actually, yeah, if we know the molybdenum grade, we can then predict and calculate or extrapolate what that means for rhenium. And so we term this extrapolated quantities. So we certainly don't try and pretend that they're resources, they're not code-based, right? But they're very important. And so it allows us to start to get a sense of like, well, how much rhenium is out there that we could start to actually look at to meet future demands. And you could start looking at all of the other metals and go start, work your way through the periodic table. All right, and this is some work we've got in our process at the moment that'll be hopefully published very soon. All right, and again, hafnium, it's a substitute element in zircon, so zirconium silicate. All right, and so again, Australia has a huge amount there. The other thing that's something else, I guess we've started more recently, is looking at the amount in tailings. And so how much can we reprocess our old tailings to potentially get old, new metals or minerals or elements out of old tailings? All right, and so this is something that I guess what we're doing is looking at a dot on the map here for every single mine. How much tailings is there? What are the likely grades? And what can we learn about the potential for critical minerals from each of these tailings deposits? Now, within that, as I mentioned, we still have to think about not only just where we get our primary supply from, but we still need to think about how much we're recycling at the end of life of a product. But then when we're making new products, how much recycled content is there in that? And this is some work that was led by Tom Gradle and his group from Yale on behalf of the International Resources Panel through the UN Environment Program some years ago. And I think what it shows us is that we've still got a long way to go before we get to this circular economy. All right, so if we look at the famous metal wheel that Barbara Reck developed at Yale with Tom Gradle, we can see we've got our mining and so on, and our smelting, refining, fabrication, manufacturing and use, and all of the links in between. And so that's really what we mean when we're talking about a circular economy. Another way to look at it is the way the Ellen MacArthur Foundation looks at it. So we've got our technological materials or our elements on the right here. And we've got maintenance, refurbishment, recycle. So there's a lot of different, from a policy point of view, there's a lot of different things we can do to help increase the value that we get out of our metals and so on. And then on the left-hand side, it's our biomass or mainly carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus as well on the left-hand side. So out of all of that, we know that our critical minerals are important. We need to be able to quantify them better. And I think one of the problems, I guess, that we've seen out there is lack of data. People confuse as lack of supply or lack of certainty. And that's certainly not the case. There's a lot of factors in it, and depending on the metals, we know that we have great confidence in the amount of metals and the amount of materials that could be used to help meet our goals and ambitions around climate change, renewable energy, as well as transport and everything else we need to do. Without forgetting that eventually we need to make sure we're moving towards a much more circular economy. All right, and so that means that we need to understand how to make our supply chains for these metals and these minerals much more sustainable. Just some acknowledgements and thank you. Leave it there.